They're screaming and crying in the high-rise blocks. It's a rat trap, Billy, but you're already caught. So rats are members of the genus Rattus, and they're members of the family Muridae, which also includes things like mice, hamsters, that kind of thing. And for some reason, people seem to get mice and rats confused. I think if you actually saw them side by side, there is absolutely no room for confusion. Rats are much larger than mice. Rats actually eat mice in some instances. And the main rats that we come into contact with are the brown and the black rats, and they're actually quite different animals. They're found in different habitats. In a more natural setting, brown rats tend to live underground, they're burrowing animals, whereas black rats are a bit more arboreal, you tend to find them in trees and stuff like that. And they've continued to hold those niches in kind of different ways as they've entered a more human-dominated world, and we should probably just get it out of the way, but rats are the most successful animals on Earth after humans, and their success is very much tied with ours. The brown rat in particular is found in pretty much every type of settlement that humans live in, whether those be little villages, towns, major cities. Rats are everywhere, and they've adapted very well. The sewers and the various dark places we've created in our towns and cities are pretty much perfect for a burrowing rat. They really have benefited from us in a pretty dramatic way. Black rats as well are also pretty common, especially in ports and ships. Sometimes black rats are known as ship rats, and despite the success of rats, we really don't like them. I think rats are probably the animals that we like the least, I think. More so than animals we're scared of, things like spiders and snakes and everything. And that's personified in the way that if we describe someone as being a rat, they're pretty much the lowest of the low. Everyone from the trade unions to the mafia refer to someone that has basically crossed the picket line or has grassed them up as a rat, because they're pretty much seen as scum from then on in. And the main reason is probably because we don't like the look of them. They are pretty minging looking animals, the tail's pretty minging. A mouse is kind of a bit more palatable. A rat's like a very intrusive mouse. And obviously the fact that we tend to find them in disgusting places, places that are unkept, places that are unclean. And they're obviously famous for the diseases that they've spread. The Black Death was blamed on rats. However, it was actually the fleas that were causing it, although the rats were obviously vectors. More recently, things like Wells disease is pretty much known for being spread by rats. But to be fair, Wells disease can be spread by a variety of animals. Rats are obviously just one of them. And to be perfectly honest, most diseases that rats can spread can also be spread by other animals. It's just the fact that we see rats, we associate them with disease, that we tend to assume it's them, that they're the sole culprits. It's not always the case. It's maybe a bit unfair, but I think a more indisputable negative impact of rats is actually their role as an invasive species. Rats are probably one of the most notorious invasive species in the world, and that is, to be fair, down to us. And like, rats as an invasive species is very much a symptom of us as an invasive species. Around the world, rats have been introduced wherever we've gone. They're very good at wiping out native populations. Things like the dodo, that was heavily down to rats. In other parts of the world, things like New Zealand, the Falklands, there's various places where there's big bird colonies that aren't used to having terrestrial predators. Rats, among other animals, fill that role pretty well, and there's been a pretty concentrated effort around the world to eradicate rats from various places. So rats are definitely, animals that don't have a great reputation. Historically, throughout our mythology and stories, and in modern day pop culture, rats have been viewed pretty negatively. The Pied Piper was probably the most famous example of rats in fiction for a long time. That was a guy that lured all the rats out this village and then did the exact same with the children. The fact that he was so heavily associated with rats in the story adds to a really negative aspect of this person who stole a load of children. And that's kind of continued. Most rats in fiction were not viewed very nicely. And animals like Ratty in Wind of the Willows, which is portrayed as a rat, is actually a water vole. Nothing to do with rats at all. Actual rats in fiction were not portrayed very well. Even things like Templeton in Charlotte's Web, who's a bit more of a sympathetic rat, is only really helping anyone out in that story when it suits himself. He's the sort of character that will only do something for someone else if he's getting something back, which is also adds to the kind of, the sort of scummy, dishonourable nature that we've attached to rats. I think the most positive rat in fiction was probably Remy in Ratatouille, whereby this rat was obsessed with cooking and ultimately became a chef by proxy. And while that is a very positive story featuring rats, and rats do come off well in it, the whole gimmick of the film is that you're letting rats cook your food in a kitchen. This animal that's so disgusting and has no business being near people, even though, they pretty much constantly around us. It doesn't quite negate the positive nature of the rats, but the whole thing is very ironic. But rats aren't always vilified. In Eastern mythology, they tend to come off a bit better. In Chinese New Year, the rat is the animal that kind of won the race, that guaranteed that the first year was named after him. And people born in the year of the rat are generally viewed as quite positive, quite empathetic people. Even in Indian mythology, things like Ganesh travelled on a rat. Again, he's a pretty well-regarded, positive god. There's actually places in India where rats have been worshipped. There's temples where rats are basically given free roam, so not everyone hates them. And rats have also been domesticated. Rats actually make surprisingly good pets. Once you get past the fact that they look a bit minging, they're known to be quite intelligent, very social, playful. They can form quite strong bonds with their owners, so they're actually, quite good pets. I know people that have had pet rats, and they tend to do pretty well. Some of them can be trained to do tricks and everything. But I think the main relationship we've had with rats isn't with them as vermin or with them as pets, it's with them as laboratory animals. Rats are the go-to laboratory animal, and there's a pretty good reason for that, and that reason is that rats are actually pretty similar to us. Primates and rodents diverged a lot more recently than they did from other mammals. It's estimated that rats actually share 90% of their genes with us, and rats are susceptible to a lot of the same diseases we have, and they've been pretty instrumental in understanding those diseases. Rats have been used in research for loads of things, from Parkinson's to cardiovascular disease to things like cancers. Like, rats have been pretty pivotal in understanding medicine, and rats have been known to do quite a lot of interesting things in labs. Lab rats have been known to solve mazes, and this is actually a skill that seems to be hereditary, because rats that are bred with other rats that are very good at solving mazes tend to breed offspring that are similarly as good. And a lot of behavioural experiments have been done with rats, and actual experiments that are actually applicable to human behaviour as well. There was an experiment done where rats were given the choice of trying to solve this puzzle, and if they solved the puzzle and they were successful, they would get a reward. But if they attempted it and they failed it, then they would get nothing. However, if they didn't attempt it at all, they would still get a smaller reward. So a lot of the rats were able to judge whether it was best to attempt it or not, which kind of shows some level of cognition in rats that I think we would definitely not want to give them. And ultimately, because we've used rats in laboratories for so long, medical science would not be as advanced as it is today without rats, and actually our quality of life would not be as good without them. So yeah, to summarise, rats are very interesting animals. They are the most successful animals apart from us, and that success is very much down to us. There is a lot of negative things about rats. They do cause diseases. They're very invasive animals. But ultimately, while a lot of us tend to view them in a pretty negative way, they're actually quite affectionate animals. They're quite good pets. And as we've experimented on them for so long, the advancements of human society, at least in terms of medicine, is very much down to rats. So in a way, they've kind of repaid us for their success in a certain way. What do you think of rats? Have you got any crazy rat stories? The chances are if you live in a town, a city or a village, or just, around other people, you've probably seen a rat in your life. I know I've seen rats like plenty of times over the years, and they're pretty cool, they're pretty fun to watch. And yeah, as ever, feel free to let me know what you'd like me to talk about next. And yeah, feel free to like, comment and subscribe, or don't if you don't want it, it's perfectly fine. I'll see you next time, and goodbye.